History often remembers battles by the number of soldiers who died or the borders that changed afterward. Yet some battles alter the fate of nations not through sheer force, but through the will of a single human being, someone who understands that fear can cut deeper than steel. Such was the case in the summer of 1462, when a small principality on the edge of Europe rose against the full might of the Ottoman Empire. And at the heart of this impossible defiance stood Vlad III of Wallachia, a prince forged by captivity, humiliation, and a hatred powerful enough to shake the confidence of an empire. Before the night attack that would terrify the conqueror of Constantinople himself, there was a childhood shaped in chains, an education in cruelty delivered by the very empire he would one day wound. The story begins decades before the clash at Targoviste, when the boy who would become Vlad the Impaler was sent as a political hostage to the Ottoman court. At 11 years old, he stepped into a world where his life existed solely to guarantee his father's loyalty. While other children played, Vlad learned the rhythms of an empire, the stern faces of Janissary guards, the hiss of Turkish commands echoing through marble halls, the smell of oiled steel and incense in the Sultan's chambers. He watched daily punishments, executions, and the relentless discipline that shaped the Ottoman war machine. He learned the language perfectly, not out of admiration, but because he realized that survival depended on observation. His younger brother Radu adapted easily, charming their captors, drawing approving nods from Ottoman tutors. Vlad, however, remained cold, vigilant, collecting every detail: how guards rotated at night, how the Sultan's officers communicated, how soldiers responded under fear or reward. These were lessons that would someday become weapons. Every insult, every beating, every reminder that he was powerless settled deep into his memory. The Ottomans thought they were molding a compliant vassal prince, but they were creating something far more dangerous: a ruler who understood their psychology better than many of their own commanders. Those 4 years of captivity sculpted Vlad into a man who believed that terror, when properly applied, was more potent than armies or fortifications. What the Ottomans planted in a boy's mind would return years later as their greatest nightmare. By the time Vlad reclaimed the throne of Wallachia, he ruled a land caught between collapsing kingdoms and expanding empires. Wallachia was small, its population barely 500,000, a fragile buffer between the encroaching Ottomans and the Christian kingdoms of Hungary and Poland. It possessed no great fortresses, no cannons capable of halting an invasion, nothing that could physically withstand an empire led by Mehmed II, the young conqueror who had taken Constantinople and shattered the 1,000-year Byzantine Empire. To most rulers of Europe, defying Mehmed was unthinkable. Yet Vlad did not see the Ottomans through the eyes of a frightened monarch. He saw them as the people who once held him captive. He saw their fears, their weaknesses, their rigid patterns. He saw a path to victory not through force, but through a calculated manipulation of human instinct. Tension finally erupted in 1459, when the Sultan's envoys arrived in Targoviste demanding tribute, 10,000 ducats and 500 boys for the Janissary Corps. This was more than taxation, it was domination. Vlad welcomed the envoys with a feast, as custom dictated. But when they refused to remove their turbans out of religious respect, he smiled, a thin, deliberate smile that belonged to someone who had already chosen violence long before the meal began. "Then let me help ensure they never fall off," he said. His soldiers seized the envoys, forced them down, and nailed their turbans to their skulls. Their screams carried through the palace for hours. The message was simple and unmistakable. Wallachia does not kneel. This savagery was not the madness of a cruel ruler, but a signal sent in a language the Ottomans understood. During his years in captivity, Vlad had learned that the Ottoman hierarchy respected strength and feared unpredictability. A man capable of such extreme actions could not be treated like an ordinary rebel. He had made himself an opponent to be feared, not managed. But the response he provoked would plunge Wallachia into the most perilous struggle of its history. Mehmed II, barely 30 and already a legend, was not a man to tolerate defiance. His armies had breached the unbreachable walls of Constantinople. They had swept across the Balkans in wave after unstoppable wave. To him, Wallachia was a minor nuisance, a stubborn thorn to be plucked out before he set his sights deeper into Europe. When word reached him of the impaled envoys, he did not rage. He calculated. A ruler who killed diplomats so brutally had to be eliminated, but not hastily. The Sultan prepared for a campaign that would annihilate Vlad's authority completely. Yet before Mehmed could march, something unexpected began to unfold along his borders. Ottoman patrols started disappearing. Reports trickled in of raiding parties butchered in their sleep, supply depots reduced to ashes, scouts found hanging from trees or missing entirely. Vlad's attacks were relentless and precise. He kept written records of every kill, exact numbers, not estimated tallies. 23,884 Turks and Ottoman sympathizers died in this early campaign, each death serving a purpose. These were not battles, they were messages. Vlad struck where the Ottomans believed themselves secure, using speed, local knowledge, and the psychological weight of the unknown. Soldiers spoke of shadows in the forests, of arrows that came from nowhere, of horsemen who vanished before sunrise. Panic spread quietly but steadily. It was during this phase that Vlad revealed his true method of warfare. He could not defeat the Ottoman Empire conventionally, so he would make Wallachia a landscape of fear. Villages near the border were fortified. Others were evacuated and prepared for destruction. Scouts mapped ambush points while local peasants learned to hide food stores in caves and forests. Vlad knew the Ottomans depended on foraging and expected conquered territories to feed their armies, so he planned to starve them. He planned to exhaust them. He planned to break their spirit before their swords ever crossed with his. By the winter of 1461, Wallachia and the Ottoman frontier had descended into a quiet but brutal contest of attrition. Mehmed II realized he was no longer dealing with a rebellious vassal, but with a ruler who understood exactly how to dismantle an invasion long before the main army arrived. And that was when the Sultan made his decision. In the spring of 1462, he would march north with an army so vast that no level of resistance, no trick, no terror could stop its advance. But Vlad had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He had known, from the day he took the throne, that the Ottomans would come in overwhelming numbers. Everything he had done, the raids, the executions, the provocations, had been designed to lure the Sultan into a confrontation where raw strength would not matter. He intended to fight not against Mehmed's legions, but against the minds of his soldiers. He intended to turn their own expectations, their own routines, into weaknesses. He intended to turn night itself into a weapon. Before the armies clashed, before the legendary night attack that would burn itself into Ottoman memory, the stage had already been set. One man, armed with nothing but intimate knowledge of his enemy and an unbreakable will, had transformed Wallachia into a battlefield where fear marched faster than soldiers and darkness hid more than shadows. Vlad Dracula had begun a war not of armies, but of minds. and the Ottomans, despite their cannons and elite troops, had already taken their first step into the trap he had spent a lifetime constructing. When spring finally broke in 1462, the Danube roared with the sound of oars, hooves, and the clatter of iron. Mehmed II's great army, an overwhelming force unmatched in the Balkans, moved north with the confidence of conquerors who believed destiny marched beside them. Chroniclers estimated 100,000 soldiers. Others said 150,000, even 300,000. The exact number mattered little, for what approached Wallachia was nothing less than the world's most feared military engine. Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry raised from childhood for war, marched in tight formations. Sipahi cavalry rode alongside them, armored and disciplined. Cannons capable of smashing stone walls rolled behind oxen. Baggage trains stretched for miles, carrying tools, food, siege equipment, and weapons enough to break a kingdom. To any rational mind, the invasion should have lasted days. Wallachia had no towering fortresses like Constantinople, no vast armies trained in formation, no gunpowder reserves that could rival an empire, but Vlad Dracula had crafted a different battlefield, one built of fire, starvation, and psychological decay. And as the Ottoman army crossed into his lands, it entered not a country, but a trap constructed with unnerving precision. The first signs appeared on the very day the vanguard stepped onto Wallachian soil. Scouts found villages eerily silent, their doors hanging open, interiors ransacked yet strangely organized. Food stores were empty, wells fouled deliberately, and livestock nowhere to be seen. Fields that should have been green with spring growth were blackened, their crops burned before they ever had the chance to ripen. The Ottomans expected resistance, not disappearance. Yet everywhere they looked, Wallachia had evaporated into the forests. The invaders pressed deeper, and the pattern repeated. Entire hamlets vanished, leaving behind only wind-swept ashes and the bitter smell of smoke embedded in charred beams. Wells contained the bodies of animals, or worse. Trees were cut down across roads, forcing detours into marshy ground where disease bred easily. Mehmed's officers, who had campaigned across Anatolia, Persia, and the Balkans, had never seen a land so willingly mutilated by its own people. Yet this was only the first layer of Vlad's design. As the army moved forward, thirst began to creep through the ranks. The water sources they encountered were either contaminated or suspiciously pristine. Soldiers hesitated to drink. Cavalry horses weakened. Already whispers spread. The land itself is cursed. But even greater dangers lurked beyond the dying wells and burned granaries. On the third night, the Ottomans faced the first true taste of Vlad's invisible warfare. As they camped beside the remnants of a village, arrows hissed from the darkness. No battle cry followed, no clash of steel, only the sudden silence of men falling without ever seeing their attackers. Patrols sent into the forest did not return. Horses bolted in terror at movement they couldn't trace. Vlad's riders attacked like phantoms, striking a watchpost or isolated tent, then vanishing before the Ottomans could react. Soldiers awoke in terror to the screams of comrades dragged into the night. By dawn, dozens were dead, yet no one had caught even a glimpse of the enemy. Fear crept silently between the rows of tents. The Janissaries maintained discipline, but even they exchanged uneasy glances, wondering what lay beyond the tree line. Mehmed, though angered, urged discipline and pushed his troops onward with renewed speed. In the Sultan's mind, fear was a weakness cured only by action. To slow now would be to play directly into Vlad's hands. but the land betrayed them again. The deeper they marched, the fewer resources they found. The Ottomans depended on local supplies to maintain speed, yet Wallachia had become a desert. Men began to starve, horses stumbled, wagon wheels cracked under the strain, and then, without warning, disease appeared. First, a handful of soldiers collapsed with fever, then hundreds. Dysentery ravaged the camps. Medical officers searched desperately for contaminated food, but found no consistent source. Rumors spread that the Christians had poisoned the soil itself. But the truth was far more cunning. Vlad had sent infected peasants into the Ottoman ranks disguised as merchants or deserters. They spoke fluent Turkish, moved freely among the soldiers, shared food, water, and stories. None were suspected. Within days, sickness roamed as freely as the wind. An empire renowned for military precision now struggled under an invisible plague carried straight into its heart. As the Ottomans faltered, Vlad watched from a distance. His scouts tracked every movement, noting where supply wagons gathered, how the Sultan arranged his banners, and which units guarded the perimeter at night. Former Ottoman captives who served Vlad provided insights no foreign commander should ever possess. They knew the patterns of the Janissaries, when their discipline tightened and when fatigue loosened it. They knew what frightened them most: disorder, deception, and the threat of unseen enemies. And so the raids intensified. A patrol investigating a ruined church never returned. A group of engineers tasked with repairing roads was slaughtered before sunrise. Supplies disappeared from guarded wagons, replaced by severed heads arranged neatly as warnings. Soldiers began to fear the night, fearing even sleep. A diary from one Ottoman soldier, later recovered near the Danube, captured their growing despair. "We march through emptiness. The villages hide, the fields burn, and shadows take our men. We do not fight an army. We fight the will of a land that hates us." By now, the morale of the Ottoman troops, once unshakable, had begun to erode. Yet Mehmed refused to relent. His pride, his reputation, even the stability of his empire depended on crushing Vlad swiftly and publicly. So he forced his exhausted soldiers deeper into Wallachia, determined to confront the impaler in open battle where numbers would finally matter. But Vlad did not intend to offer such a battle. He intended to stretch the Ottomans until their discipline snapped. He intended to use exhaustion as a weapon sharper than any sword. And he intended to strike not when the Ottomans expected, but when they were most vulnerable, when fatigue, disease, and fear had hollowed them out from within. Meanwhile, Vlad's own forces, though far smaller, remained agile and well supplied. They knew the hidden streams, the safe wells, the untouched granaries buried beneath false floors. They traveled at night, crossed swamps on secret paths, and disappeared into forest cover that the Ottoman cavalry could not navigate. Wallachia, though scarred and burned, belonged entirely to Dracula's men. Everything pointed toward a single moment, a confrontation shaped not by power, but by psychology. Vlad was preparing his masterpiece, a blow that would echo across Europe and stain Ottoman memory forever. But before he could execute it, he required a final piece of intelligence so daring in its acquisition that even his closest commanders doubted his sanity. He would need to walk into the Ottoman camp itself. And on a moonless night, dressed as a Turkish merchant, Vlad III Dracula began the most audacious reconnaissance mission any ruler had attempted. He slipped into the enemy host, undetected, to memorize its heartbeat from within. What he discovered there would determine the horror that followed. The night Vlad slipped into the Ottoman camp was moonless, thick with drifting smoke from distant campfires, and heavy with the murmuring breath of an army numbering in the tens of thousands. The vast encampment stretched across the plains like a living organism, rows of tents forming arteries, guarded watchposts serving as nerve endings, and at the center, the Sultan's great pavilion glowing faintly like a golden heart. The air vibrated with the clatter of horses, the hum of distant voices, and the rustle of canvas touching canvas in the cold wind. To step into this world wearing Turkish robes, armed with nothing but flawless language skills and a merchant's forged papers, was madness. Yet to Vlad, it was simply the next move in a war he had already fought countless times in his mind. With 6 trusted scouts, men as fluent in Turkish as in their mother tongue, Vlad approached the camp from the western approach, where supply caravans arrived daily to replenish Mehmed's colossal host. The guards, exhausted from days of phantom attacks and sleepless nights, barely raised their heads as the group approached. Suspicion dulled by fatigue, they only glanced at the merchant documents before waving the newcomers through. Who would dare walk willingly into the jaws of such a beast? Certainly not the prince they had come to destroy. Inside, Vlad's senses sharpened. He moved slowly, deliberately, adopting the posture of a man familiar with military logistics, carrying himself with the quiet, weary confidence of someone accustomed to selling grain and cloth to armies on the move. He nodded politely to guards, exchanged a few casual greetings, and let his gaze sweep carefully over everything that mattered. The Ottomans believed themselves invincible. Their discipline in daylight was legendary. But night revealed the cracks. Tired guards leaning on spears, officers distracted, janissaries tightening straps around their armor with sluggish hands. The layout of the camp was precisely what Vlad expected. The janissary quarters were arranged in perfect order, their tall white tents illuminated by soft lamplight. Cavalry tents clustered around the horse lines, where thousands of tired animals stood tethered in long rows. The supply wagons were organized by category: gunpowder, rations, tools, medical materials. Vlad memorized everything: how close the gunpowder lay to the cavalry, how narrow the passages were between tent rows, how easily panic could choke such confined corridors. Then he saw what mattered most: the Sultan's pavilion. Towering above the rest, draped in rich silks and marked by 3 golden crescents, it stood like a shimmering beacon. Guards posted at precise intervals circled it with rigid posture. Vlad began counting their steps, the distance between them, the angle at which their torches cast shadows across the entrance. This single tent was the hinge on which the fate of the invasion could turn. Kill the Sultan, and chaos would engulf the Ottoman army. Spare him, and the war would bend toward a different, but equally devastating conclusion. As Vlad watched, he noticed something more subtle, yet immensely valuable. The Ottoman password system used distinct phrases for each camp sector, but all shared a predictable rhythm. The responses followed a familiar pattern, one the guards repeated mechanically. To an outsider, it would sound foreign and complex. To Vlad, who had spoken Turkish since childhood, it was simply a formula. With such knowledge, his infiltrators could move through the camp almost as freely as the soldiers themselves. Hours passed. The scouts split off, gathering additional intelligence, each careful to maintain the illusion of harmless traitors. One casually leaned against a wagon while noting the fuse lengths on the gunpowder barrels. Another chatted with cavalrymen while counting the position of their spears and shields. Nothing escaped Vlad's attention. By the time the group exited the camp in the same unremarkable manner they entered, they carried within their minds a complete map of Ottoman vulnerability. The moment he returned to his own forces, Vlad felt the enormity of what he had seen. The Ottomans believed their size made them secure. In daylight, it was true. But at night, the camp was a labyrinth of confusion waiting for a single spark to ignite it. That spark would be his cavalry. When Vlad gathered his commanders and described what he had observed, an uneasy silence settled over the camp. Even these hardened men, fighters who had raided Ottoman borders for months, struggled to imagine how 7,000 horsemen could charge into a fortress of living flesh and iron and survive. But Vlad's confidence never wavered. He spoke with a clarity that stilled the doubts in their hearts. They would not attack 150,000 soldiers. They would attack the idea of the Ottoman army, its order, its discipline, its sense of invincibility. The plan he revealed was not a charge, but a symphony of terror. His cavalry would divide into 7 wings, each assigned a precise path through the Ottoman camp. These routes were not random. They followed the exact corridors he had walked, the same fire-lit alleys between tents, the same narrow tracks where bodies could pile quickly and confusion could spread with the speed of fire. The first strike would not be with swords, but with infiltration. Turkish-speaking scouts would slip inside before the attack began, planting slow-burning fuses in the gunpowder wagons and cutting loose the horses to ensure chaos the moment the battle began. The cavalry wrapped their horse hooves in cloth, blackened their armor, and prepared for silence rather than thunder. Vlad's men knew the risks. Many quietly prayed, kissing crosses or murmuring oaths of vengeance for families taken by Ottoman raids. Their prince did not promise victory. He promised purpose, the kind of purpose that made men ride willingly into the mouth of an empire. As midnight approached, a windless stillness settled over the plains. The Ottoman camp slept in uneasy calm, unaware that death crept toward them with muffled hooves. Vlad positioned himself at the forefront of the assault, mounted on a black warhorse, his cloak blending into the darkness. He carried no torch, no ornament, only the cold certainty of a man who had shaped this moment for decades. He raised his hand, and the world seemed to stop. At exactly 1 a.m, the fuses lit. Tiny sparks crawled slowly toward barrels heavy with powder, and in the same instant, Vlad lowered his hand. 7,000 silent riders surged forward, swallowed by the night. The attack on the Ottoman Empire had begun, not with a roar, but with a whisper. The first moments of the attack were so silent that even the night seemed to hold its breath. 7,000 riders glided toward the Ottoman camp like a tide of shadows, their horses' hooves muffled under layers of cloth. No banners fluttered, no trumpets sounded. Only the faint exhale of disciplined cavalry broke the stillness. Vlad rode ahead of them, his silhouette merging with the darkness, the cold air filling his lungs like the last breath before a plunge into black water. Inside the Ottoman camp, exhaustion had dulled vigilance. Guards paced their routes mechanically, blinking against the fatigue that had gnawed at them for days. The distant groaning of sick soldiers, the intermittent cries of horses, and the scattered murmurs of restless men formed a monotonous background that lulled the camp into uneasy slumber. The night smelled of sweat, sickness, and damp earth. Then the first fuse met powder. A sound like the opening roar of a storm split the night, a thunderous explosion that tore through the center of the Ottoman camp with the force of a rising sun. A fireball erupted into the sky, turning the landscape momentarily bright as day. The heat slapped against the tents in waves, and the shock wave knocked men from their beds. Horses shrieked in blind terror, pulling free of their tethers and stampeding through aisles of canvas. Before the Ottomans could understand what had happened, the second explosion detonated, then a third. Flames spiraled upward, hurling debris into the darkness as slow-burning fuses reached their marks. The camp woke in absolute chaos. Screams, shouts, and the thunder of collapsing tents filled the air. And into that rising nightmare rode Vlad's cavalry. Like a blade splitting flesh, the first wave plunged into the perimeter, cutting down the stunned guards before they could shout an alarm. Riders swept past them, slicing through ropes, slashing tent supports, trampling panicked soldiers who stumbled blindly into the night. Vlad had predicted exactly how the Ottomans would react, with confusion, with fear, with the desperate instinct to form ranks. But the flames, the explosions, the screams, they disrupted every attempt at organization. Worse still, the Wallachians shouted in perfect Turkish, "Form ranks in the eastern sector. Protect the Sultan's pavilion. The enemy is disguised among us." The Ottomans turned toward the voices, believing they came from their own officers. But when shapes emerged from the smoky glow, some wearing gear stripped from earlier raids, no one could tell friend from foe. In the suffocating darkness, panic fused with recognition, then with doubt, then with violence. Janissary units charged toward the fire-lit chaos, only to collide headlong with Sipahi cavalry galloping in the opposite direction. Neither group knew which direction held safety. Steel clashed against steel not by design, but by instinct. Screams multiplied. Men trampled one another. The ground, churned by terrified horses, became slick with blood. Through it all, Vlad carved a path straight toward the heart of the camp. His cavalry followed with deadly precision, striking the exact corridors he had memorized during his infiltration. They knew which rows of tents housed officers, which structures stored grain, and where the command staff might regroup. Their movements were not chaotic but orchestrated, each group of riders severing a different artery of the Ottoman host. The flames behind them rose higher still. Massive plumes of smoke coiled through the camp, illuminated from within by burning canvas and exploding barrels. The air hissed with embers. Shadows leapt wildly across the ground, creating illusions of armies where none stood. In the midst of this inferno, Ottoman soldiers cried out for commands that never came. Officers stumbled half-dressed from their tents only to be cut down before they could rally their men. A few tried to sound horns, but the noise of battle swallowed their calls. Others called for torches, but the fire had stolen the night. By the time the Sultan's elite guards understood what was happening, Vlad was already nearing the central pavilion. He rode like a man possessed. His eyes burned with a cold, calculating fury. Flames reflected off his armor, painting him in molten orange light. Every swing of his sword tore another gap through confused defenders. Behind him, his finest cavalry thundered forward. 200 riders chosen specifically for this final thrust. The great pavilion loomed ahead, rising through the smoke like a massive beast crouched beneath the stars. Golden crescents gleamed atop its peak. Vlad recognized the sight instantly. He had been here only nights earlier, walking calmly among the guards who now died under his blade. He burst through the outer ring of defenders, cutting down the first man before the guard could even shout. A second guard lunged at him, sword raised, but Vlad parried and struck in one fluid motion. His horse crashed through the tent's entrance, tearing down silk panels as his riders thundered in behind him. But the interior was wrong. Instead of the Sultan, the tent held only the Grand Vizier and several startled officers scrambling for their weapons. The realization hit Vlad like a blow. Mehmed had moved his sleeping quarters. The information he had gathered, perfect in every other detail, had missed the one point that mattered most. In that instant, time seemed to fracture. Riders behind him were already engaged with elite guards. Janissaries, finally finding some semblance of order, began converging on the pavilion like iron closing around a wound. Vlad had only seconds. He cut down the vizier in a blur of steel, but the true prize was gone. If he hesitated now, he and his best warriors would die trapped inside the collapsing heart of the Ottoman camp. A single horn blast pierced the chaos, the signal for retreat. Leaping back onto his horse, Vlad wheeled around and broke from the pavilion just as the Janissaries crashed into the tent, their blades striking the empty air he had occupied moments before. His cavalry followed, slashing their way out, disappearing once more into the smoke-choked night. Ottoman forces pursued, but in the darkness they collided with their own men more often than with the retreating Wallachians. By the time Vlad's riders vanished beyond bowshot, the camp resembled a shattered hellscape. Tents burned, horses lay screaming on the ground, officers bled out beside soldiers who had accidentally killed them. The sheer magnitude of confusion defied belief. And yet, for all the destruction, the Ottomans had survived. Mehmed still lived. His army still stood. Vlad had struck with devastating force, but the war was not over. Instead, something far deeper had been sown. Panic, exhaustion, humiliation, and the first cracks in the armor of imperial certainty. The Ottomans would march again at dawn, but they would march no longer as conquerors, only as men wondering how many more horrors awaited them in the heart of Wallachia.